Now, the last part of my talk is what I'm calling implications for the innovator. So, you folks out there who have decided to go down this tricky path, and instead of developing the next great consumer product, then the latest blender or other thing, you're going down a more difficult road where you're going to deal in the medical device or FDA regulated space. And there are some things that you need to be aware of if you work in this space that you don't necessarily have to think about if you work in innovation in other product areas. And because the costs and the times involved with obtaining FDA approval and with doing the testing that you need can be so time consuming and so expensive, it's really important to get some things right the first time. And I'm going to talk, this is sort of my personal opinion based on being in this business now for about 22 years, I guess, what I think the most important things are as an innovator for you to be thinking about. And the first of these is the right timing, and that is that it's never too soon to start thinking about the regulatory considerations. And when you put together your business plan, you'll find that when you submit things to funding organizations, they're going to want to know, well, how have you thought about FDA regulation? What's your plan for doing that? And one of the things, we've talked about the difference between a regulatory pathway for something like a 510K or a PMA. Oftentimes what I find when I work with innovators is that they've got an idea, and we can turn that idea, it maybe won't be exactly what they want, but if we tweak the device or the indications, sometimes we can make it be a 510K and not a PMA for the first version of the device. And then once you have that initial product out there, it's easy to make changes. And so I like to talk about the basic approvable unit, which is the simplest version of the device that's the easiest thing to get through FDA. And in fact, sometimes these aren't actually devices you actually are going to ever sell. They just get you past that initial hurdle so that you can start raising some money and get to the device you really want to sell. And the right regulatory approach, and I mentioned this already. Small changes, they may seem very small to you, in device design or targeted population can really impact the level of regulatory oversight for a product. And when you think about it, how FDA classifies devices, it depends on what the device is and the indications for use. And so oftentimes, if you have a product and you want to say that your novel diagnostic product is going to be used to diagnose cancer, well, I mean, that's going to be a PMA. I mean, I can tell you, even not knowing what the technology is or what the cancer is, I can tell you that that's what it's going to be. On the other hand, if you want to say that this is a tool that's used as an adjunct and provides information that the clinician can use, and so, softer language, then a lot of times you can get those products through the 510K pathway or potentially maybe the de novo pathway. And so it's very important to work with somebody who understands the regulatory implications of indications early on, because it's amazing how much difference the pathway can be. You should be monitoring the FDA website and trade publications to what FDA publishes information about every device it clears, every PMA it reviews. And the other thing is that you have to have a regulatory person that has a seat at the table when you're making some of these early business decisions. And if you don't have a lot of people early on, use consultants. And it is something that you can't think about early enough. The right science, and this, there is what constitutes the right science is often a matter of debate, but FDA has some fairly entrenched approaches to certain things. So, for example, if you've got a product that is going to contact the patient's body, if it's going to contact the skin, or if it's invasive, or if it's an implant, FDA has a guidance document and approach towards biocompatibility that is cast in stone. You have to follow that. If your product is electrical, there are standards for electrical safety testing and electromagnetic compatibility that are essentially cast in stone. So it's important to be aware of these things that are essentially requirements and make sure that you understand what you need to do. You need to be thinking about these things early on, and in addition to consultants like myself, you'll find that there are a lot of third-party test houses out there that do this testing for you, like biocompatibility. There are organizations like NAMSA or Nelson Labs, and they have people that are very helpful there that are willing to work with you early on. And if you go to them and you say, okay, here's my device, and and these are the tests I think I need. What is your experience? What does FDA usually require? They're another source of useful information for people starting out. The right submission content. So you've gotten past the point, you've developed your product, you've got the right indications, you've gone out and you've done all your testing and you've put your submission together. That also, there are things you have to be aware of. FDA is now requires almost everything to be submitted electronically as well as one paper copy. And they have a e-copy formatting system, and they're very picky about it. And their system, if it doesn't like your what you submit, it will spit it out, and they'll tell you to come back when you get it right. So it's important to do that. The 510K pathway, there's something called refuse to accept, and if your 510K does not include all the required elements, they'll send it back to you and they'll tell you what you're missing, and they won't start reviewing it until you have it. There's a user fee payment system, so most of these submissions require user fees, even for startups. And one of the things that they allow you to do is to pay less money if you're a small company, but in order to do that, you have to be designated a small business. And that's its own, you have to go through that process. You have to submit tax forms in order to show FDA that you're a small business. So it's important to be sort of thinking about all of this stuff up ahead as well. When you put your submission together, the most important thing I can tell you is you don't just dump the data on FDA. A lot of people just want to give it all to FDA and let them figure it out. You don't want to do that. You want to tell FDA a compelling story about what you've done and what your data show, because this is your chance to sort of set the stage and to frame your device the way you want to frame it. I like to say don't break into jail, so you want to give FDA everything you need to give them, but don't give them things they don't need to have. So it's important to make sure that you give everything that you're supposed to, but that if there's a test or something that is not favorable, but you still have to provide it, don't try to hide it or ignore it. FDA will find it, and they'll, if they think that you are deceptive, once you lose your credibility with FDA, it's gone for forever. So it's important to, always be honest and truthful, but only to provide what you absolutely have to provide, and to make sure that you're clear about why things haven't gone right when they don't go right. The right expectations, and that has to do with what to expect from FDA. They want you to come and talk to them early on. And they've got a lot of programs that allow you to submit pre-submissions and get feedback that can be very worthwhile. But what they will tell you is that they're not a consultant. If you want a consultant, if you want somebody to tell you what to do, you have to go out and hire one. When you go to FDA, what they want to know is you have to come in with a plan, and they'll review your plan and give you feedback on your plan. But you can't just go in and say, what should I do? You won't have a successful meeting with them if you try to do that. And then sometimes what I find is sometimes startups, they want to go in and ask FDA about everything. And sometimes it's better just to give them what you have. Because if you go into FDA and you say, well, here's what I'm thinking about doing, they're going to tell you what they think the best way to do it is. And then if you go back and you haven't done what they told you, they're going to say, well, we told you what to do. How come you didn't do it? On the other hand, if you don't go in and ask them and you do something that's close to what they want, but maybe not entirely what they would have asked for, a lot of times they will accept it if it's 80% of the way there. And so there is a fine art to deciding when to go in and ask questions and when to just submit your data. As I mentioned, it's important to do, if you go in and talk to FDA and they give you feedback, you can't ignore what they tell you. That is one of the quickest ways to develop an unsatisfactory relationship with them. And so you have to, make sure that you address the issues they've identified. The other thing is that FDA has user fee timelines, and they are picky about what they submit because they have to meet these goals. And if you submit something that's half-baked and that is not well put together, you're going to get back a long letter with lots of questions, and it's going to make them think you don't know what you're doing, and it's also going to prolong the process. Um, the other thing is that you have to understand that FDA is an organization of people, and even though it tries to ensure consistency, there are differences even between individual reviewers in the same review group. So I have a client that I've been working with that works in the multi-parameter monitor space, and they develop central nursing stations and equipment that's used in hospitals to manage patient data centrally. And I've worked with them now for about 2.5 years, and we've probably submitted 10 or 12 different 510Ks to FDA for essentially the same kinds of devices. And it's just, I was at FDA for 17 years, and I always thought FDA was fairly consistent. And it's amazing how different of a review you can get from different reviewers. And it's going to happen, and you just have to be prepared for it. Finally, it's never a good idea to be rude or confrontational with FDA. There are some people out there, and there's some consultants out there that sort of take that approach. And I can tell you that it's never going to be advantageous for you. You can be firm. You can, if FDA is not following its own procedures, you certainly have, there are ways to appeal decisions, and I encourage people to do that when it's appropriate, but you always want to be polite. And then finally, once you've gotten your product through FDA and you now can legally market it, you have to have the right exit strategy. And as I've mentioned, getting the product cleared or approved is only the beginning, because once you have FDA's clearance for your product, I always like to say that's like a driver's license. If you don't have a car, you're not going anywhere. And the car in my analogy is the quality system regulations and all of the other things you have to do to legally sell a product. And so a lot of times innovators find that they will develop a technology, they'll get their 510K cleared, they'll get it through FDA, and then the best way to do it, if they've got something that somebody else wants, is to license that technology to another company that will be responsible for actually marketing the product. And so it's a common exit strategy for people who really don't want to become medical device manufacturers. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the third bullet here, the medical device manufacturer, that is what you would do if you decided that you wanted to develop your product and you're going to actually go out there and sell it. And as I mentioned, that requires you to do a full quality system and be the person who's responsible for meeting all of these other FDA requirements. Now, in the middle, you have this option to become something called a specification developer, and that is where you maintain the license for the product. It's still your technology, and once you have done that, then you can work with a third party who would be responsible for actually doing the manufacturing and doing the design control stuff for you as well. So these are the different options that you have as a medical device manufacturer or as somebody who's going to simply just license their technology. So that being said, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, Donna B., we do have a question submitted. You mentioned working with knowledgeable people and consultants as early as possible, and there seem to be many of them out there. So how do you know which is the best group to work with?
Yeah, and I probably have a bias because I worked at FDA, but if you can find somebody who's actually spent time at FDA, that's the first question to ask is have you been, and then the second, then you want to ask if they haven't, or even if they have, you want to understand what their experience is. Have they worked with products like yours? I mean, I get calls all the time for people, and my approach is when you call me, I'll tell you what I know about your product area, whether I've worked in it or not. And you want to find people who have done that. It can be a little bit tricky. I mean, one of the things I also have done is sometimes I end up in rescue mode where a client has worked with somebody who doesn't maybe know what they're doing, and now they've gotten into trouble, and I'm trying to help them get out of trouble. So the place that I would suggest, you can look at is one of the things is there's an organization called RAPS, RAPS, Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, and that is the society that a lot of us in the regulatory affairs business belong to. And they actually have a credentialing program called the RAC, Regulatory Affairs Certification, maybe I think is the C. So if you've got somebody who hasn't been at FDA but they have a RAC certification, that's another good indicator for you that the person is is well trained. And then you would also maybe look for people who have experience working for medical device companies. A lot of those people who have done regulatory affairs at a company go off and they now start doing regulatory affairs as a consultant as well. So I guess, and the other thing is you can try to ask for references. Unfortunately, like for my company, we don't give references because my clients, a lot of them don't want to be disclosed. So that's what I can offer.
Okay, thank you. Drew does have a few things to add, and before he does, I'll just remind people that are on the call still that you can submit questions to either Donna B. or Drew using the chat feature at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I was just going to add, Donna, maybe you can kind of comment on this. Clearly, in a very research-centric environment like we have here at the University of Michigan, the kind of things that people can do well now on applications that they're working on that may be being managed through oversight through something like the IRB. When I think about it, the things that are just good general software practices for folks, such as documentation in the most basic case, but test cases and validation scenarios are things that come to mind. Traceability is something that, in my mind's eye, from a design standpoint, should start early. So the ability to kind of match your requirements back to the actual functions that sit inside the application. And then, probably the thing that I think I run across where people could certainly think about a little bit more extensively are things such as the kind of the basics of GMP, just source control management via a traditional source management system, whether it be GitHub, Bitbucket, CloudForce, locally, whatever it is. But I wonder if you had anything you could add that might be helpful to our PIs relative to things they can do today when they're in the early stages of development.
Well, I agree, Drew, with everything you said. I think those are all important points. What I find is the hardest thing is getting people to write down requirements. People want to develop sort of high-level requirements, and then they immediately go to writing code. And then we have to go back and write detailed requirements. So that's something that I end up doing again and again. I think the other thing is to think very carefully about using what kinds of off-the-shelf software components you decide to use and how you integrate them into your product, and both from a eventual licensing perspective, but also from a making sure that the off-the-shelf component is appropriate given the potential risks and the capabilities of your device is also something that I think people need to think carefully about. And then last, cybersecurity and privacy. These are also huge issues. They're not, the patient privacy issues and HIPAA are not so much FDA issues, but there is, a lot of ways to get into trouble with privacy issues and software. And so it's really important. It's another area that you need to be thinking about from the beginning. You most definitely should never be sending patient data around in the clear. It always has to be, at the very least, it has to be encrypted. And you need to be thinking about those considerations early on.
Great. I had one other thing, and just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, please feel free to submit those kind of in the chat box. But one other thing I'd like to get your perspective on, and maybe a comment for the folks participating, is I often hear when people have read the FDA guidance, especially the part that's talking about discretionary enforcement, well, there's 1.3 million apps, at least on the iTunes store as of the first part of February, and I don't know what the last number was, but 75 billion-ish downloads. It's somewhat finding the needle in the haystack. That's I think people need to be reminded that the consequences of getting it wrong can be significant, and maybe just some insight on what that is. In other words, the fact that it's hard to find and they're using the notion of discretionary type of approaches is not an excuse to not do the right things on the front end.
Yeah, one of the things is that FDA does not have the resources to go out and police the app stores. I mean, there's too many things and too much changing. So, some people take that as a license to just go off and do whatever they want. I'll tell you, when where you get into trouble with that is if you've got something and it becomes popular, and you now have something that is successful, which is what you intended it to do, then it's more likely to come to their attention. And if you get yourself into a situation where they believe that you did not act in good faith, then FDA's approach to how it deals with things like that are very different than if it feels like that you're somebody who's operating in a gray area and maybe you had one interpretation and they might have had a different. And so there's a very sort of different set of reaction you get from the agency when they find you, or if they find you. And I guess one of the things that a lot of my clients find is that they're developing apps that they want to be able to make available to third-party payers, who are one of the huge groups that's very interested in these, particularly with trying to help to keep healthcare costs down, and apps that help manage members, people who are in an insurance or in an HMO, these healthcare tools that can be used by those patients to help give them better outcomes. They're quite savvy, and what you will find is that they're not interested in things. They're going to want to know, well, is this FDA cleared, or does it need FDA clearance, and why? And so, you will find that a lot of the people that may be potentially interested in these products are going to want to know that you have appropriately considered the FDA regulatory requirements as well.
Great. So one thing I would add to that for people participating, I mean, one of the Office of Tech Transfer here at the university is kind of the gateway to publishing under the university's account onto all of the application stores. So that's the Apple side as well as Google. But that we have that process, we like to believe, fairly well structured, but a significant aspect of that is on the front end of that process. We actually work with biologics and Donna in particular in doing a FDA early screen as to whether the application might potentially be regulated. So that's something to keep in mind for everybody on the call, that's a service that we have within OTT to give you an early look based on what you're trying to do as to if the application is potentially going to be subject to oversight. I had one more question. Again, I'll just ask people if they have anything, please submit them. But can you talk a little bit, in the mobile guidance that was published by the FDA, they have an interesting contrast about what I'll call monitoring and what is monitored that is considered disease management versus more of an acute disease situation management. And the examples that are very close together in that guidance document, we've talked about this before, is one says that discretionary enforcement or potentially, if I recall correctly, that it isn't monitored, is things like blood glucose monitoring in a diabetic application. I believe the example that is used is kind of remote monitoring, potentially reporting that to a parent if a kid has glucose monitoring, as potentially not being regulated because it's managing a disease, versus something that's cardiac monitoring for an acute event. And if you have any thoughts about how to look at that or approaches when you read that guidance.
I think the issue there is the distinction between what's called this medical device data systems that I talked about. So these are what were these class 1 devices that FDA said it's going to exercise enforcement discretion over, that are just intended to move data around in a non-time critical manner, and share information, versus in the hospital you have multi-parameter monitoring systems, and you have things that have to operate in a real-time sense. And so historically there's been this distinction between information that is time critical, or has historically been called real-time monitoring, versus sharing information in a non-real-time setting. And so I think that there is this, it really comes down to risk. What is the risk if the information is not delivered in a timely manner? And the more that information needs to be delivered in a timely manner, and the more critical the amount of time that elapses is, the greater the likelihood is that FDA will consider it to be a monitor. For example, cardiac monitor, it's a classified device. And so are glucose monitors, but usually historically glucose monitoring devices are used. The patient takes their own blood glucose, and then they take some action based on that. The issue with the child is a little bit more of a tricky issue, but I think that it's this difference between, it's really to what extent time is a critical factor has been my experience.
Great, thank you. And I think that's, I mean, it's a good example, I think, for the folks on the phone as to why, not to put down on the hot seat, because I know that's a tough question, but it's an example of the need to have really good quality help when you're working through this, and somebody who's navigated these kind of challenges with the FDA is something that's really, really, I think, helpful and very,
and
very
I think it's a really
important.
great example of what I was talking about before, because if you were developing that kind of an app, let's use your glucose, and you labeled it as, provides immediate notification to the parent so they can take action to address it, you are definitely dipping your toe into regulated medical device territory. On the other hand, if you just wanted to say, enables the patient to keep informed about what's going on with their child, then you may be more in MDDS territory. And so those are the fine distinctions in the kinds of statements you make about devices that can really have a big impact on whether it's regulated or whether it's not. And in this software area, more than any other area, little differences like that can have significant regulatory implications.
Okay, if there are not any more questions from the audience, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, Donna B. and Drew, for your time today. I'll give one final reminder that I'll follow this up with an email with a recording of the webinar, Donna B's presentation, and an evaluation. And I will remind folks that next week, Drew and I will be back when we welcome Paul Stevens, an IP attorney out of the Chicago area, to talk about a recent Supreme Court case named Alice and patent eligibility for apps and software. So you can register for that event or that webinar next week by replying to my email or visiting our website. So thanks again for all those that joined us today. Have a great evening.